Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arthur Brooks. I'm president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm honored to welcome you to this event today featuring IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde, as well as my colleague Desmond Lockman, in a conversation about what we're experiencing today in the world economy, the advantages that we see, the problems on the horizon, and to get a little bit of what is in Madame Lagarde's crystal ball about the coming months and years. Many of you are as conversant as I am or more in Madame Lagarde's incredible background. As you all know, she's been managing director of the IMF since 2011, widely considered to be one of the sharpest minds in financial policy matters and public policy in general. She started much earlier in her career as the head of the Chicago law firm Baker & McKinsey, and then was Minister of Finance of France before joining the IMF. Janet Yellen once remarked, remark with which I concur, that Christine Lagarde is unique in combining vision with action. Before I turn it over to Madame Lagarde and Desmond Lockman, I just want to say one moment why I admire her so much and am so delighted that she's with us here today. Many of you know that the American Enterprise Institute, this institution which has been around since 1938, is dedicated fundamentally to two moral principles, not policy principles, not financial principles, but moral principles. That human dignity is radically equal between all people with no exceptions, and that human beings have limitless potential if only we can find it. These are ideas, moral ideals that can be animated and brought to life on our best days with good public policy, but we need leaders in the front line that believe in this fundamental philosophy as well. Policy ideas are simply not enough. The best policy leader I know who shares these views is Christine Lagarde. It's interesting in the world today of dramatic political and ideological polarization that it seems that in the United States and other countries, including France, either you're on team markets or team welfare. That's a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. It's a bad choice because it's not one that we need to make. The truth of the matter is that democratic capitalism has pulled 2 billion of our brothers and sisters out of poverty since 1970, and one of the greatest blessings that democratic capitalism has created is our ability to look after our brothers and sisters in need with social safety nets, with welfare programs, indeed with systems that involve redistribution. It's not one or the other. It's a creative approach to how we build the fabric of public policy, remembering the people at the margins of society. No institution has been more explicitly dedicated to this than the International Monetary Fund, lifting up nations such that they can serve their citizens, looking out for the people at the periphery of our society. And we need moral leaders at the helm of institutions like the IMF, and we have that in Madame Christine Lagarde. I am so honored to have her here today, sharing our principles and sharing her wisdom with us, Managing Director Christine Lagarde and Desmond Lockman.
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody as well, and I'd want to say a special thank you to Madame Lagarde for coming and visiting us again. She's always welcome here, and this time around, she's coming at a very opportune time, just before the G20 meeting in Japan, and at a time that the global economy has got many challenges. So maybe if we start, if you could give us, some indication of how you see the global economy right now. In April this year at the spring meetings, you noted that while the global economy was having a synchronized recovery in 2018, it was now running into a delicate moment, and I wonder how you see things 2 months later.
Well, thank you so much, Desmond, and thank you very much, Arthur, for this extremely flattering introduction. But yes, the moral principles that you've referred to, I certainly abide by them and respect them highly. It's not without a little bit of anxiety and some trepidation that at the last spring meeting in April, we actually coined the world economic outlook as we presented it as a fragile and with a precarious recovery in sight. So the test of that description is really what happens after we made the forecast. And we were, in a way, quite pleased, and not very happy, but quite pleased to see that this fragility that we had identified and the precariousness of the recovery is actually confirmed. And the 3.3% global growth that we forecasted for 2019, we are maintaining certainly this forecast. And it's a downgrade by 0.4 relative to our forecast of October 2018. So it gives you an indication of this fragility that we identified because we downgraded, and also because, as opposed to the 70% synchronized pickup that we had seen in 2017 and the first half of 2018, we're now seeing this sort of synchronized deceleration of growth, which is shared by about 70% of total GDP around the world. So that fragility is still the same. It's a little bit differently distributed than what we had assumed. So most recently, the results for the US economy have been slightly better than what we had anticipated. Slightly better also the European Union. But on the other hand, some of the emerging market economies have been lower than we had thought. Japan is a bit of an outlier in delivering pretty good and solid results at the moment. Precarious recovery, it certainly is the case. And we are seeing risks to the downside, and some of the risks that we had identified back a couple of months ago have actually begun materializing. You know, one of the risks that we had identified is the risks associated with trade tensions. And 2 months ago we said, be very careful what you are doing with this major growth engine that is trade. Because anything that breaks on trade, such as tariffs, such as non-tariff barriers, is going to actually be a break on growth. And unfortunately, we're seeing some materialization of these risks that we had identified a few months ago. There are a few other risks that that are in the making, which are not necessarily materializing, so to speak. But Brexit is certainly a risk on the horizon, for which additional time has been given to the parties. So everybody has now until October to actually come to terms with the actual exit and the way in which exit will take place. But it is still a risk that bears as a downside one. So we see the recovery that we are still forecasting for the end of 2019 and 2020, because we have a forecast of 3.6% for 2020. We see that as still in the cards, but precarious.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much where we are.
Thank you. I guess, though, that the downside risks in some sense have got more serious, that what I'm thinking about is that we're now getting a intensification in the US-China trade dispute, and that's now been broadened to Mexico, and there's a threat a little bit down the road, that the US postponed for 6 months introducing tariffs on European and Japanese automobiles, a 25% tariff. That's got to be a rather major risk. At the G20 meeting, presumably that's going to be a principal topic of discussion.
My suspicion is that under Japanese presidency, the G20 meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors will address the issue of trade. I mean, I don't see how they could leave that to the side. It's a real topic. In the blog that I have released today, which borrows very much from the G20 surveillance note that has been prepared for the finance ministers and the central bank governors, what we try to do is to actually try to model and figure out what will be the impact on growth of what had been announced and is being implemented, and what is now being threatened in addition to what took place. And if you combine the two and you aggregate what is already in place and what will impact trade, only dealing with China, let alone Mexico, which is a more recent development and which we have not included in that particular surveillance note, that alone would shave off the forecast that we have by 0.5%. Now, you might say 0.5% if you are, a country that is growing at a steady pace in some of the sub-Saharan countries or even in China is not a huge amount. But if you look at global growth at 3.3% this year, and more so next year, 3.6%. You take off 0.5 in 2020, which is when we have calculated the impact of the trade restrictions, you're now talking about 3.1%. Absent special, fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus of some sort that would be put in place if countries are very concerned about the impact of the trade restrictions. So it's a significant impact and one that is in the making because you have China, you have what has been announced as potentially implementable soon on Mexico. You have the 6 months suspension, which might lead to believe, a contrario, that in 6 months' time, bearing other developments, it will materialize. You have the elimination of the preferential tariffs on India, which only impacts a very small portion of trade with India, but which is a signal that nothing is warranted. So, when we try to analyze from an economic point of view the impact of those trade restrictions, we actually aggregate several impacts. You have the direct impact of trade, which is not gigantic, and then you have the market impact, and then you add the confidence impact, which clearly has a bearing on investment and future decisions of economic actors.
Yeah, I can agree with you totally, that the impact could be enormous because we've just got to think what happened in November and December when the US-China trade talks weren't going well. We saw markets slump by like 20%. So the impact, it seems to me that this trade issue, they really are playing with fire. That this could really derail the global recovery, through the financial market channel. But hopefully we don't get there.
I hope we don't, because you see that one of the big differences. Stop me if I talk too much, but one of the big differences between now and say, when we had the last big financial crisis, is that the space that is available to policymakers has been significantly reduced. You look at the monetary policy and the space that central banks around the world have, not much, really not much. And they have played out many of the tools available in unconventional monetary policies. You look at the fiscal position of many countries, despite many iterations, reiteration, contradictions, and all the rest of it on those matters, many countries do not have any space. Some countries have a little bit of fiscal space, and you count on the fingers of one hand those countries that have a lot of fiscal space.
Yeah, well, I guess that is one of my concerns, is that the largest country in the world has used its fiscal space at a time that the recovery was very strong. So when the recovery gets weak, it's going to have limited fiscal space. But I guess another reason for concern about this trade issue is that it's not playing out in isolation. You mentioned Brexit, that we could have a hard Brexit. We just had a bad European parliamentary election result in the United Kingdom that looks like it's pushing towards a difficult situation in October. But then there's also issues like the Italian government in the latest election, that they seem to be going down the path of rather irresponsible fiscal policy. So I guess we're just not looking at this playing in isolation, which is, I guess, increases the urgency of trying to resolve this, that this is no time to be opening up another front, on the trade side.
Correct. And in many ways, those are, particularly on trade, those are self-inflicted wounds. And it's, politics aside, frankly, it's frustrating because we had seen in the post-crisis period trade decline gradually over the course of time, when before that it was double the global growth rate. And it was beginning to come up again and to rise, but 2 points above global growth rate. And if you look at the WTO numbers, if you look at the bank numbers, our numbers as well, we have indications now that trade is slowing down yet again. And yes, that is a frustration, and we don't need to do that. There are issues, they have to be addressed. The WTO system needs to be improved, re-energized in many ways. The dispute resolution system needs to be fixed and needs to be functional. But we don't have to inflict wounds to ourselves. And it's
Right. Well,
not going to leave many winners.
Right. I guess, what one could say is that if the whole idea of trade restrictions is to try to reduce external imbalances, for instance, if you take the United States, if trade restrictions are to try to reduce the external imbalance, that's not what's going to do it. What's going to do it is sound fiscal policies, that the United States needs to save more, and the European Germany perhaps needs to save less. Germany needs to have an expansive fiscal policy. The United States needs to have a restrictive fiscal policy. What role do you see for the IMF in trying to get that conversation going? That in past years you had multilateral surveillance to try to get a better balance between the various countries, reduce the deficits of the ones who had large deficits, right. And similarly on the surplus side. Is there much scope?
There is, in that we produce every year something that we call the external sector report, which is informed by many, many, many data and which has the benefit, contrary to the sort of bilateral comparison that you were referring to, or the current account assessment on a bilateral basis, which brings all systemic and critical countries together to arrive at an overall system where we determine whether or not the situation of a country, and in particular the situation of its exchange rate relative to its position, is actually in line, or whether it is not in line with the fundamentals of the economies. What the Japanese presidency of the G20 has done is asked us, the IMF, to produce a special report on this issue of the imbalances around the world. And we are producing that report for the G20 at the Japanese presidency request. What's interesting in the report is that post-crisis, we have seen the imbalances shrink. If you think of China back in the immediate pre-crisis period, and you look at China's current account position at the moment, massive difference. It's gone from an 8-9% surplus to a very minimal surplus now. So emerging market economies have essentially shifted their position to being almost balanced, and where we see now, so that has shifted. But imbalances have not disappeared. They've shifted from being within the emerging market economies predominantly to being within the advanced economies and between advanced economies. So when you look at the US situation, as you just indicated, strong deficit. If you look at the German position, strong surplus, and has been growing, although it's beginning now to decline because the investment of Germany has now started picking up a bit. So I think the sort of, I hope that the collective wisdom of the G20 under Japanese presidency will be to look at those numbers, to look at the facts, to look at the causes of those imbalances. And there are some legitimate causes. When a country is aging, when the population is saving, then it's obvious that it's going to deliver a surplus. But it doesn't explain and justify some of the surpluses that we observe at the moment.
Right, but a lot of the problem is in the area of public finances, I guess. That countries that are running big deficits on the trade side are also running big deficits on the budget side. And it seems that it's not very logical that if they're running big budget deficits, what that tends to do is it tends to force the dollar higher, which is also counterproductive. So not only are they saving less, but they're having a strong dollar.
True.
It just seems, at least to me, it seems, I guess I've got more liberty to say this than you do, but it seems rather misguided to have a tariff policy to cure this problem. That if you're running a big budget deficit, the United States has had the experience of twin deficits before. It looks like we're going down that path, that over the past 2 years, the deficit's been increasing rather than narrowing. Let me ask quite a different question. We mentioned Brexit could be a problem. I mentioned that Italy, could be a problem. I wonder whether you could tell us going forward, what kind of role would the IMF play in resolution of a problem, say within the Eurozone? You could argue that in 2010, Europe wasn't equipped to deal with these kind of crises. But since then, they've established the European Stability Mechanism. The ECB's got the outright monetary transaction window. My question is, would the role of the fund be different? Would we be seeing the fund working with a troika, or is that something of the past that the fund might still be involved, but it would be a different kind of involvement?
If I look back, I started that period of financial crisis as a finance minister, as a player at the Eurogroup table, and then I shifted to the IMF in 2011. If something of a similar nature was to happen now, if there was a euro area sovereign debt crisis, for instance, God forbid, because those were not happy days, and I really hope that it doesn't happen again. But for the purpose of our discussion here, if it was to happen, it's a different world. It's a different world where, as you said, the ECB has explored various mechanisms and tools that it could use again, some of which have not yet been totally explored, but I'm sure Mario and his successor would be able to use that. Second, there is the European Stability Mechanism, which is endowed with over 500 billion euros, which was not available at the time of the Irish, Greek, Cypriot, Spanish crisis, and a few others. So that's also a huge, big buffer that is there, and that could be called upon if a bank was in a very difficult situation, because they've allowed for that to operate as a backstop under certain conditions. So that's one. Not to say that the sort of incestuous loop between banks and sovereign has been completely severed. That's not happened yet. And I think that's sort of mission to be completed. There is a resolution mechanism that has been negotiated, agreed upon, and which is enforceable in all the systemic banks in Europe. So there are tools there that could be used. I think that both the IMF and the ECB would, if they were asked to intervene and to help, would operate in a different capacity. I don't want to speak for the ECB because they're big boys and they can do that for themselves. But for us, I think that we would be working hand in hand with the ESM if the countries wanted us to do that. We have a membership of 189 countries. The euro area as such is not a member of the IMF. But each and every 18 members of the 18 members of the Eurogroup is a member of the IMF. So we might, again, help if it was needed. But my guess is that the Europeans who have built this ESM would want to call on the ESM to be the sort of first line of defense. And I'm not sure that we would use the concept of Troika anymore, because the Troika was the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and us. I think it would work differently. And they're trying to build fiscal capacity within the ESM as well in order to build up expertise.
But the big difference now is that the Europeans wouldn't be as dependent on the IMF financial resources as they were before, because presumably the European Stability Mechanism has the $500 billion, but more importantly, the ECB has got an unlimited amount of euros that they could use. That the OMT is pretty open-ended.
Well, yes, and you might argue that thanks to the European Court of Justice and the various recourses and the various actions that were taken against some of the decisions made by the European Central Bank, the European Central Bank board and its president will know within which parameters it can operate and with what prior consent, prior consultation, and so on and so forth. So there is more room. Is it unlimited in the way the Fed could be? I think you need to ask Mario Draghi before he goes.
Well, I guess I was just thinking of his comment is that he would do whatever it took. And I guess that's...
Oh, no. We had a big discussion on that because he said, you're right, he said that was the day when the London Olympics started. We had that same day of conference. And he said, because we debated that, he said, within my mandate. And it was critically important, particularly vis-a-vis... I think both the Bundesbank and the Bundestag were very concerned that within our mandate
that was sotto voce. That I don't think the markets saw that. They just saw that whatever it took. And I just wonder whether you might not use that technique in the next crisis, that the fund will do whatever it takes. It seems to work magic. Let me ask you, in terms of IMF resources, what is the situation with IMF resources, in the following sense, if we were to have another crisis, it seems that these crises take quite a lot of money to resolve. Yeah. So if you did get, for any reason, a crisis, is the IMF adequately financed, or is there more that you need to do on that front?
Oh, there's always more that I would like to do. But let me give you two numbers. Our capacity to commit at the moment is roughly $1 trillion. So with the reserves and everything else, we have roughly $1 trillion that is available and that we can mobilize in order to help countries around the world. The second number that I want to give you is $500 billion. And the $500 billion is how much we actually committed during the great financial crisis. So when we had this massive financial crisis, short of a Great Depression, we committed $500 billion, and I think we were instrumental, together with many others, in trying to avoid that the Great Recession turned into a Great Depression. So how did we do that at the time of the Great Financial Crisis? We had, in the structure of the resources, we had quotas, which is a bit like, hard capital. And there were new arrangements to borrows that I represent for myself as sort of syndicated medium to long-term loans. And some of those were actually converted into quotas over the course of what we call the 14th review, which is like a capital increase. But the borrowing, which is done much more easily, was increased, and some of the borrowing was put into quota. What I want to make sure happens, because we are reviewing our capitals status and our resources envelope is to maintain our overall resource envelope. And short of increasing the quotas now, what I want to do is increase these syndicated loans, the new arrangements to borrow, as it's called for those who are in the know here, so that the total capacity to commit remains at $1 trillion. Because you never know. The next crisis can be worse than the last one. So we need to be sufficiently strong. And I think we need to give markets the signal that the fund is going to be equally strong on the occasion of this capital and borrowing reviews. So that's
I guess
work underway.
I guess one area that might give you some room is that just what we've been discussing about Europe is that this time around, Europe can take care of a lot of its own needs, whereas presumably last time around, the big IMF programs were in places like Greece and Portugal and Ireland. Presumably this time, you're going to have the ESM and the OMT that can help. So perhaps you might have some room that you didn't have in that previous.
Yeah, fair enough. I think the global financial safety net, as we like to call it, has changed. No question about that, because the European Stability Mechanism is one big pocket of financial availability that is there, only for European countries. But you also have in various corners of the world, in Asia, for instance, you have the Chiang Mai arrangement, under which countries of Asia-Pacific, short of full description of the countries in there, have also aggregated resources for the rainy days. So they have funds that is available as well, under which we have a close collaboration and which we have sort of stress tested in order to make sure that if something happens, the Chiang Mai arrangement, which I think has $250 billion available, and us can actually operate together in an efficient way. And then you have a few other sort of pockets of financial resources that are available as well that could be mobilized eventually. I think what the G20 leaders are all saying is the IMF is at the center of the global financial safety net, and we have to play a critical role because we've been doing that for 75 years this year. It's our anniversary, actually. And we have accumulated experience, expertise. We know how conditionalities can function. We don't always do it to perfection, but we have tried as hard as we could to improve it and have a recovery rating, which is not bad.
Right. Well, I guess that's another reason why one would want these various trade disputes resolved, because this really doesn't create the right kind of atmosphere for international cooperation. Or the United States has had such a role of leadership of resolving crises, working with the IMF, so hopefully that gets resolved pretty soon. This morning you put out a blog in which one of the factors you mentioned that is of some concern is the big increase in corporate borrowing.
Yeah.
That it seems, the United States, not only the United States, but I guess the emerging market economies, that their corporations have been borrowing a lot, and that what we're seeing is a deterioration in the credit quality. I think that Mrs.
Correct.
Yellen keeps mentioning, the United States leveraged loan market of something like $1.3 trillion. Aside from having a concern, there's not much that we can do at this stage. That seems to be a problem that we've got to live with. That's the result of past policies, or were there some kind of policy prescriptions you had in mind?
I think it's a problem that is not only a problem in the United States. The corporate debt is prevalent pretty much across the board in all countries. And what is of additional concern to us is the quality of that debt, which we see as having declined here, as having declined in Europe as well, in many of the countries comprising Europe. Clearly, in a period of accommodative monetary policy as we have it, and as we will probably continue to have it, and legitimately so in our view until numbers actually firm up and we see inflation rising its head a bit more, we are seeing an accumulation of financial vulnerabilities. That's what we're saying also in the G20 surveillance note. So short of using monetary policy because we have no inflation, because we have rather sluggish growth, then other tools need to be used. And that's where macroprudential tools have also been developed, elaborated. I don't think that we have enough history of the impact of macroprudential tools to actually say, well, this works, this you should use. The kind of collaterals that are used in those leverage loans should be transferred or changed. But I think it's coming along, and there are many more central bank governors now who are comparing notes and looking at prudential tools to see what is effectively working. And we're beginning to see good signals. But that has to be, financial stability has to be a concern which should not necessarily interfere with the monetary policy and which requires, in our view, an additional set of tools, the prudential tools.
I guess I could just finish before I turn, we could use the remaining time that we've got for questions from the audience. Just a couple of questions on the emerging market economies. One, the program in Argentina has had its problems. I was just wondering how you see that right now. Are they getting things back on track? That would be the one question. And the other is there are two economies that seem to have real difficulty, real crises on the currency side that could have big impacts on the economy. The one, of course, is Venezuela, and the other is Turkey. I was just wondering whether there's scope or at what stage can the fund get involved with those two countries?
Well, first of all, we have to be asked. And that's a big precondition, because if the authorities of a country do not want to ask the IMF to be involved, no matter how we regret, lament, and feel terribly sorry for the people in some instances, that is certainly the case for Venezuela, there's not much that we can do. All we can do is prepare as much as we can on the basis of numbers that we have no control over, an economic situation that we have not been able to audit for the last 15 years because we have been barred from accessing the normal, delivering the normal mission that we have with all members. So all we can do is, from a distance and based on sporadic information and contacts that we have with a few people who are still on the ground, is try to assess what, in our view, based on what we've seen, is likely to be just the most difficult, protracted, and complicated economic situation that we have seen. And not just economic, because you have a humanitarian crisis, you have a food crisis, you have a currency crisis, you have inflation which is in the millions %, and the debt situation which is extremely complex as well. So you have to bring this all together. It's like having, you take the 3 worst cases of crisis resolution that we have ever handled in the history of the IMF. You bring them all together, and that is Venezuela.
So it's like a war situation.
Oh, it's really a.
Turkey must.
And we don't have the data, we don't have the tools, we have not seen it in real life, other than through the prism of the humanitarian crisis that is playing out.
Turkey, there must be more hope that something can be done.
Well, I hope the authorities can actually handle the situation and can they have a teeny tiny bit of fiscal space. They have a private sector that is massively indebted. They have inflation running high. They have a currency situation which is also pretty dear. And I don't think that President Erdogan would actually pick up the phone to ask me whether the IMF can come and help.
But this would be a classic case for the IMF to do something.
Yes.
Right,
yes,
but I
yes.
understand
but
it takes
maybe,
two to tango.
Yeah, exactly right. Which takes us to Argentina,
Right, okay.
naturally.
That was, I had thought of that segue. No, it's not true.
In the case of Argentina, first of all, I'm reasonably and hopefully positive about the most recent developments. It's an economic situation which was incredibly complicated as well. That I think many players, ourselves included, underestimated a bit when we started trying to help and put together with the Argentine authorities a program to address what had been critical for their economy, which was the fiscal position, which was the current account position. On both those accounts, the situation has significantly improved and is continuing to show signs of improvement. I guess the most surprising component, but which is improving now in the most recent numbers that we received, is inflation, which instead of stabilizing and gradually declining as we had anticipated, is showing much more resilience than we had thought. It is now beginning to decline, but it's taking longer than we had anticipated. I'm hopeful that with a steady continuation of the program as it is, with the monetary mass as the anchor of the program as it is now, I'm really hoping that the Argentine program will actually turn out to be successful for the Argentine people and for the Argentine economy. There are political, developments that will come into play over which we have no control, of course, and which will be the decision of the people. But from an economic point of view, very hard legacy inherited by the previous team. Difficult situation to address from all angles, fiscal, current account, inflation, and the issue of the exchange rate, which is like the barometer for the people. But my hope is that, keeping steady, hopefully
and
will
there, of
deliver.
course, the Macri government is very committed to the program.
Oh yes, they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yes.
Right. With your permission, if we
Please.
could just turn it over to questions. I think that what we'll do is just take like 3 questions at a time. And if I turn to you, if you could just identify yourself and perhaps please keep it to a question rather than a statement. This gentleman over here. This one. Yeah.
Hi, Carl Golovin. Historically, constitutionally, gold and silver coin were the money in the U.S., and their circulation provided great stability for the working people. Of course, the velocity at which gold could move through the economy was a limiting, constraining factor. With new blockchain and wireless technology, is it possible for the gold to be remonetized and circulate and exchanged in the economy digitally and serve as honest money?
I guess that question was directed at me. I'm originally South African, and the answer is go for gold. No, I'm kidding. This gentleman over here.
Hi, thank you. Mark Tenney, Mathematical Finance Company. One of the issues with the protectionism by the U.S. is it's hard for us to sell insurance services to Africa because they don't have the risk regulatory framework. Mark Green talked here from USAID, and his people, Thomas Ward, said that American insurance companies can't sell into Africa because they don't have the risk regulation set up. So if Prudential wants to sell there, the state of New Jersey would have to do it. Paul Kupiak at AEI has agreed to set up a relationship with actuarial groups in the U.S. And some of the actuaries in South Africa were here a couple weeks ago, and they would like to be part of a project to set up a regulatory systems for countries in Africa near South Africa.
Could you come to the question?
So the question is, would you be willing to become part of this dialogue that Paul Kupiec at AEI is part of talking to actual groups in the U.S. and South Africa, with the IMF to develop a capacity to help set up regulatory risk systems for insurance in developing and emerging countries?
Thank you. That gentleman up there.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. Madame Lagarde, is it possible that the multilateral community has relied too much on trade as the primary engine for developing countries to develop their economies, to the exclusion of other forms of development that perhaps should receive more attention?
Thank you. I would just take one more.
Barry Wood, RTHK in Hong Kong. Ms. Lagarde, you've attended most of the G20 meetings. It's their 9th year, I think. How should this forum be strengthened? We know its strengths, but are there shortcomings? For example, I see there are 50, 60 people in the room. Is that too many?
The role of gold and silver and how it can be associated with distributed ledger technology, it's something that we have not explored, but certainly we are very, very keen to explore distributed ledger technology for all sorts of purposes, particularly in the fintech world. And when it comes to accelerating cross-border payment, when it comes to remittances, when it comes to a lot of the transactions that are being conducted at significant cost and with great length of time, we believe that that technology can be of great use. Much more, I think there is much more interest in that technology now, separate and independent from the Bitcoins and the Ethereum and all the rest of them. Now, I think the IMF would actually argue that sort of going back to fixed exchange rate and the sort of the guarantee of gold or silver, whatever, would actually reduce the flexibility and the sort of shock absorbing capacity that flexible exchange rate have demonstrated over the course of time and with a financial crisis as they went. But all ideas have to be explored and considered, and I think we should be open to ideas, whatever they are. American insurance in South Africa. We have a South African desk at the IMF, and clearly we do not operate at all, ever, at the request of any particular groups, any particular segments of the business. This is not our mandate. This is not our mission. We act at the request of countries, and we provide either policy guidance, surveillance, technical assistance, training, and what have you. If South Africa was interested in, having technical assistance to elaborate a better regulatory framework for insurance distribution, development, or whatever, we would certainly consider whether we can best do that, or whether the World Bank is not better qualified than we are. But it's in that relationship between a member and the institution that could eventually be conducted. Have we relied too much on the multilateral system, or has the multilateral system rather relied too much on trade to the exclusion of other mechanisms? When you look back and when you see how much has been improved, thanks in particular, but not to the exclusion of others, to trade, I don't think that we should have too many regrets. Should it be to the exclusion of other channels of development? Absolutely not. And I think that the summit that took place in Addis Ababa, for instance, was it now 4 years ago, when sub-Saharan African countries in particular decided to explore how they could develop, how they could reach the Sustainable Development Goals, and concluded to the fact that it was not going to be just about trade, it was not going to be just about aid, it was not going to be just about international institutions, but it was also going to be about their own economic development and their own domestic revenue mobilization and having control over their destiny. I think all tools have to be used and not to the detriment of others, but I think trade will continue to play a significant role. And it's not actually randomly that all sub-Saharan African countries have now concluded a pan-African free trade agreement, which has just recently entered into effect because it was finally ratified by the required number of countries, and where clearly there is a big upside to be had amongst sub-Saharan African countries in order to develop their activities. When you look at the volume of trade regionally between sub-Saharan African countries relative to the volume of trade that they have on their raw materials and commodities with advanced economies, there's a huge upside to be had locally, as there would be a huge upside in developing and trading services in a less constricted and less constrained way. G20, are there too many people in the room? You know, you're right. I have attended, I think, all G20 leaders summit ever since the crisis. And there were no G20 leaders summit before the crisis. So I think I've attended them all. And I would concur with many observers who will say that it's never as efficient as when there is a crisis. Because crises, bring about a sense of urgency, a sense of cohesion and need for cooperation that is, an unparalleled tool for achieving results. Same happened with the construction of the European Union. And Monnet would have said that. He would have said, Europe will develop one crisis at a time and through crisis. So, too many people? I'll give you my personal view. It's not an IMF orthodox, proper view. It's my view. I think the problem of the G20 at leaders' levels is that because it goes from one presidency to the other, each new presidency feels committed and obliged vis-à-vis the previous presidencies to sort of take over the legacy and say, I don't know, Japan, for instance, was very focused and concerned about population, about aging, about demographics. Well, I bet you that, I don't know, but I bet you that Saudi Arabia, which is the next G20 presidency, will probably, as a courtesy to Japan and out of politeness and respect for Japan, will say, we will continue looking at demographics and aging, and probably they will be looking at it from the other perspective of this youth population that is coming to markets and that needs jobs, whereas Japan was looking at it from the other end of the life cycle. But each new presidency wants to have its own pet topic. So over the course of 10 years, you have at least 10 pet topics which have been carried over from one presidency to the other. And sometimes it's actually healthy when one member says, let's be sensible. Let's just wipe out some of those that we have examined to death, and let's just shorten the list of topics that we're going to be concerned, focused about, and where we're going to be active. There are lots of things that the G20 has achieved recently. If you look at the determination of the G20 to fight against tax evasion and profit base, it's not shifting, it's the BEPS, base erosion, profit shifting. There has been significant progress. The automatic exchange of information in order to fight those two phenomena. I think on corruption, I hope we're going to be able to also make some progress going forward. In infrastructure, there is a hub that was set up under Australian presidency, which has been taken over by the two successive presidencies, and which is now delivering a set of best practices, best tools in order to develop infrastructure in a more coherent and effective way. So I think it's delivering value, probably not as visible or nor as much as when we had the crisis. And of the 60 people in the room, you have a good group of them who are generally sitting in the second or the third row who are effectively doing the work. So you need them in the room.
Thank you very much, Madam Lagarde. You've been extremely generous with your time, and you've been really frank and open with us. I really appreciate it. I would just ask if people can remain seated while Madame Lagarde leaves the room. But before that, I'd ask you to join me in just thanking her for... Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Whoops. Oh, yeah.